Hey, City or Philly team. It's good to see you again. I'm excited to talk with you a bit more about the report we looked at a few months back. Just so you know who I am, in case there's some new faces out there, I'm Scott Richards. I worked with you all back in June or July. Got to visit Philadelphia and spend a couple of days in the city. Had a great time. And like I said, I'm looking forward to being here and walking through a number of key places in the report that you all have. So if you've read the email and you're tracking along, you either have the report in front of you or accessible to you, so that we can talk about a number of different areas. And what I'm going to do is I will share my screen, kind of point out or highlight some key places in the report. And then I'm going to invite you to pause the video at certain times. And I'll throw a couple of questions out at you that you could just reflect on and make your own connections to several places in the report. So we'll look at what I'm calling the three biggest takeaways. That'll be on page 3. We'll look at kind of the from and to diagram on page 14. We'll look a bit closer at some of the data and some of the insights from the interviews on pages 4 through 9. And then we'll wrap up with looking at the DBIE approach that's on page 15. All right, so let's get started. Let's jump in. I'm going to share my screen and bring you to the first place that we'll look at, which is the executive summary on page 3. And what I want to draw your attention to is really what I think are the 3 biggest takeaways. That it's one of those, like, if nothing else, remember this about what we learned and the work that we did together. And so to help draw our attention to that, I'm going to highlight on my screen those things that I'm talking about. The first one is that in order to really move, right, you all from kind of one place to the next, is to really develop a shared understanding of the core DBIE concepts, vocabulary, and constructs. And so I envision this number one as just building a foundation of what are kind of the boundaries of the parameters around what do we mean when we talk about a DBIE approach, and clarifying what that means for your team and your region, and being really clear and committed to that. The second area is building leadership practices that allow you all to really transfer learning from different situations and events to new areas, and to really incorporate that into the day-to-day work at City Year in Philly. And then the third is developing shared accountability practices that support individual and collective agency around the DBIE goals that you all have. And I think that as we spend some time really talking through this through video and with you all, that this will become more internalized for you as you think about what does that mean for us and what does that look like and how did we arrive at that place. There's one other area that I want to look at just as you consider those 3 big takeaways, and that is, how do we get there? What did it take for us to arrive and say, hey, these are the kind of the 3 broad biggest lessons or insights for you all to think about? And that is, I'm on the executive summary. If you just kind of go up a little bit to right here, this is the approach that we took to learn with you and alongside you all. One way that we developed this was through interviews and conversations with you all. And those are the focus groups or the interviews that we held on site in Philadelphia. And so that allowed us just to get in conversation and dialogue with you and members of your team. The second was looking at internal materials and artifacts and data that you all rely on in the day-to-day, or that have been a part of the work that you all have done over the past few years. And then the third area is just in collaborating and working alongside the City or Philly team and kind of developing what would this approach look like and how do we do this. So the reason I'm sharing those couple of things is because one, if I were in your shoes and I was starting to think about, okay, I've got this report, I've got these insights, I want to get in action, I want to do them. Here's two questions that would be on my mind. First of all, is like, at the end of the day, what is this report about? And number two, how are these like recommendations and how are these takeaways put together? So first, the takeaways, we're going to build a strong, solid foundation around DBI, vocabulary, core concepts, and practices. Number two, we're going to develop leadership practices that allow us to engage in new and different situations. And then third, we're going to build accountability practices that allow individual and collective agency towards our goals. We came up with those through conversations with staff, looking at data, and just collaborating with the city or Philadelphia team. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, which I'll come back to in a moment. And I want you to pause the video and take like 5 to 7 minutes. And I want you to think about a couple things. One is just note or underline, I don't know how you're accessing the report if you have it on your computer, but just note those 3 biggest takeaways and what are the key words that stand out to you. Make note of those. What resonates or what questions do you have? And then also just take note of that second area. How were these developed? Where did this stuff come from? How do we know that these are the things that we're relying on for this report? So after 5 or 7 minutes, come back, press play, and we'll move on to the next section. Welcome back. That was my cue to bring you all back, and I hope that you're tracking along with me. So, in a moment, I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to look at the second place that I mentioned is the from and to. So the way that I think about this is essentially those 3 big takeaways: the idea of building shared understanding, developing leadership practices, establishing accountability practices. That is kind of the bridge that we build to move from one place to the next. You probably remember me talking about when I was with you in person or talking with you over the phone potentially, that we're all on a journey. We're all in a process of learning and growing. We're in the day-to-day grind of this work and carrying the burden and the load. And we're never going to kind of accomplish or arrive at perfection. We're always going to be in the process of learning and growing. So the idea here was to really kind of paint a picture based on how people at City or Philadelphia talked about the current state of DEI. You remember probably us talking about that, and future aspirations. So I'm going to share my screen again, and we're going to go look at page 14 in the report. And I'm pulling up my screen as I'm talking. And what I want to notice or draw your attention to is this diagram that you have probably seen and read through. So let me talk a little bit about the from and to place. On the from side, this idea of discontinuous or cyclical, I know that there were questions about this before, but it was the idea that kind of like we've been here before. I don't know if you've seen the movie Groundhog Day, this idea that we've been here before and it doesn't seem like anything is necessarily new or different. So we're kind of stuck in a cycle in a sense. Now, nobody necessarily used the word stuck, but there was a lot of reflections on like feeling like things are unresolved or feeling like things are incomplete or fragmented or inconclusive. There's some people talking about sometimes things, topics, or we're talking about this seem abstract or theoretical. We're not like bringing it down to the day to day. And then I gave some examples of what the from place could be like, limited or lack of communication, sometimes disconnect between the tools and resources that we have. So this from place was really rooted in and is really rooted in people's experiences, things that they shared as we were in conversation and dialogue. And the to place is a mix of 2 things. One, what were people's aspirations for DBIE at City or Philly? And also from our perspective at Rethink, what would that look like to kind of live in an alternative future with that work at City or Philly? And so we thought about this in terms of that the experience would feel more comprehensive and embedded, that people are developing capacity, in different moments and situations that can transfer to new and novel situations. There's collaboration, there's connection, there's a sense of shared accountability, internalization. So you can kind of see the list of words there. And then examples of like, what might that look like in the day-to-day? You might have remembered me asking or talking to you about, can you give me an example of that? Or what would that sound or look like? And so these are some of the ideas that came up from you all in talking about the from and to. And here again, I want to make a plug for the three biggest takeaways from this report. To get from this place to a different place would require building a shared foundation around DBI concepts, vocabulary. Two, building leadership practices that are transferable to new and different situations. And three, building accountability practices, both for individual and collective agency. So again, I'm going to stop sharing my screen. I'm going to invite you to pause the video in a moment and think about a couple of questions. One is, when you hear me talk about the from to space and you read that on page 14, what resonates with you or what questions might you have? And then the second question is, how do you see the bridge getting from one place to the next at City or Philly? So again, you're looking at page 14 in the report. You're noticing that, okay, you have this kind of understanding of like, what are the three big takeaways? Where did all kind of the ideas in that come from? And now you're starting to piece together, how will this get us from one place to the next? You might be thinking to yourself, for example, yeah, you know what? Some of those things in the from place really resonate with me. I've sat in meetings or been in places where things have felt disconnected, or I haven't been quite clear on what we're doing, or things have felt inconclusive. And you might be thinking, yes, like the to place does resonate with me, or there might be questions about it. Again, remember that this is a journey that we're always learning and growing. It's not, from an imperfect place to a perfect place, or an incomplete place to a totally complete place. It's just moving from one place to the next and following this bridge or this pathway together. So give you a few minutes, take 5 minutes, pause the video when I kind of shut my screen down, and then come back together and press play, and we'll keep going. All right. So the next place I want to look at are in the interviews. And so as you remember from the executive summary, there's a number of places we went, or data or artifacts or things that we used. I'm not going to go over all of those different areas in this video. My point in this video is really just to drive home the idea that for you as leaders at City or Philly, there are really those three biggest takeaways that are important for you all to hold on to and really internalize. That we're going to build shared foundations around DBI concepts, we're going to develop leadership practices, and we're going to establish accountability practice for individual and collective agency. And that should start to really kind of, as we talk through it and have time to debrief this and have more conversation, really start to get into, okay, I know where that came from. I know what role that can play in getting us to a new place. And I know more about what that would look like in the work that we do at City or Philly. I know there's probably a lot of interest in that question, like, where did this come from? I think that the interviews actually do a really good job of illuminating many of those different aspects of the three biggest takeaways, and then that kind of from and to place. So I'm going to pull up pages 4 through 9 on my screen. Give me a moment, and then we'll look at these together. So I'm scrolling up to page 4, and I will just mention a few things. On page 4 here, you can read about how many interviews that we did, how long they lasted. And as you look through these pages, there's a lot of information that you could read and kind of understand. And again, the point of this section is I'm going to bring us all the way back down to, like, when we read through all of this data, we're going to come back to those three big takeaways again. And let me show you what that looks like. The first is, if you remember, there were a set of questions that we asked every focus group and in every interview. And across each of those questions, although we were in different groups by affinity or by different identity markers, there were patterns in each question, even on top of being in different groupings. And so if you read through these first few pages, you'll see patterns that emerge in each question. For example, if you remember, we asked about genuine concern. And so you'll see just samples of like, what did people talk about, or what are ideas or themes that came up? And you can see that by each question. The second thing to note is that there were themes across all of the groups. So not only by question, but sometimes even though you're talking about a specific question, there seemed to be a theme or pattern that came up consistently across multiple questions. And so these are highlighted on blue, or highlighted blue, starting on page 6. And I'll just draw your attention to a couple. One is this idea of unresolved conflict around DBIE issues. And in these sections, I provided a short kind of summary of what I think that theme captured, and then a couple of quotes that illustrate that. You could do the same thing around, for example, perceptions of it action. So you could see that there's this sense of like, I think this first quote talks about, we're oftentimes seen doing this dance where there's one-off trainings or incrementally moving things forward. There's not a real system or structure. Again, no, as I was saying before, that this is not a matter of moving from, to trying to find how do we do this perfectly, but really to understand where we at and where do we want to grow towards. And so I'll let you spend some time in a few moments reading through these different themes that came up. There's a section on analysis, but here's where I want to zero in on is these initial recommendations. And in a moment, I'm going to pause I'll ask you to pause the video and read through each of these initial recommendations and make your own connection to the three biggest takeaways. Again, you're looking for connections to building a shared understanding around DBIE concepts, developing leadership practices that are transferable across different situations, and establishing accountability practices at the individual and collective level. So I'll look at one together, and then I'll ask you to pause. One of the things that came up were different conversations in these focus groups. Keep in mind that that's what we're talking about, focus groups or interviews, this idea of positionality, and understanding like, what does that mean in different contexts? How are we to consider positionality? Are we supposed to look at there? I think there are questions or comments around specific identities, these identities versus others. And so there's a sense of how do we do that? So this initial recommendation is develop a shared vocabulary on these ideas related to positionality. So I'm going to let you pause the video, read through each of these 4 initial recommendations, and notice the connections you make or you notice to the 3 big takeaways. All right, welcome back. I hope that as you read through those initial recommendations, you started to see some parallels to those 3 big takeaways. And what you'll notice, one of the things that I wanted to be true in this report is that as we listen to the experiences, perspectives, and aspirations of City or Philly team, while people could have different experiences, different perspectives, throughout our work with you, what started to emerge was kind of a pattern and themes around what is true about the kind of the current state, and what is true about the shared aspirations, and that there really was this bridge, right? That if City or Philly team could commit to and say, yes, we believe that this is the right path for us, that you could start to see the progress and the growth over time, where you start to break that discontinuous or cyclical or kind of fragmented or kind of feeling incomplete process to where things feel different. And so I think where you start to see some of this come together is in this last section that we'll look at on starting at page 15. And I'm going to share my screen again. what starts on page 15 are the those three key recommendations, or those three key takeaways, kind of spread out over multiple years. And then if you scroll down beyond this, it looks at, if you were just to take 1 year and kind of deep dive what would happen without that year, within that year, what would that work look like? The reason that that we developed this for you all was to see what would it look like to really build shared understanding, develop leadership habits, and establish accountability. What would that look like over time, kind of like a macro picture over multiple years? Also, over this next year, what kinds of things would we be doing together? What are we learning about together? How are we building the foundational skills? What are the leadership habits and traits? And you start to see some of that come into focus. The thing that I would say that makes this work, as you all kind of internalize and process this, is that it's really grounded in the three biggest takeaways and moving you all kind of from one place to the next and crossing this bridge, which I think is a good metaphor, but kind of incomplete, because once you get to the other side of the bridge, there'll always be more bridges. There's always more things to learn and grow. I think the idea is that we're learning to build the capacity to do that over time. So let's look at how that kind of plays out in this table on page 15. I'm not going to go and read through all this, but I'm going to set you up to do some work on your own and just kind of making your own connections. The way that this table is structured is the domains are those three biggest takeaways, right? So by now, you've heard me say it enough. You know them. What we're building a shared understanding around DBIE concepts, developing leadership habits, and establishing accountability practices. What I want you to do is really zero in on, if I can pull up my annotate function again, year 3. And the reason I'm looking at year 3 is because if you kind of like teleport yourself into the future and think about, the City or Philly team down the road, what does it look like for you to show up to work every day and be like, you know what, we are nailing this. Like, we are on it. We are doing, I don't want to say fantastic job, but like that makes it sound like we've arrived, we completed something, but we are where we want to be and continuing to learn and grow. That's the idea. So for building a shared understanding, what that could look like is that staff, right, are consistently leading meaningful, rigorous, proactive dialogue around those issues or patterns that have the most impact on people of color, and I would say historically marginalized groups in your community and across your team. So there's a sense of, we know how to do this. We know how to have the dialogue. We know how to have the conversation. We know how to restore restore workability. You've heard me talk about that. We know what that looks like and how to really do that well. And the other thing I would notice here for you all is that to get up to a year 3, there's some work to do over year 1 and 2. And this, again, is intended to kind of map out, I don't know that the year 1, 2, and 3 are the exact timeline or the exact, months and time frame. But the idea is that there's a progression of things, that in order for us to get to a point where we can consistently lead these types of conversations, that we have that shared understanding of what does historical racism and exclusion look like in our society, but also day to day in organizations, and in particular in education organizations, and maybe particularly in the schoolhouse that I know I hear you all talk about a lot. So it's kind of like grounding that piece, and then also being able to engage in, what does that mean for the conversations we have? What are the spaces we need to create as staff to really explore those dynamics and have the types of conversations where we feel like we're learning and growing together? And I think there's room for everybody in that space, right? Like, nobody has arrived at any one place, but we're saying that this is the work we're going to do. So we get to a year 3 reality of, we feel like I want to say doing this well, but I think you catch the heart and the spirit of what I'm talking about. And then I'm going to just kind of drop down. What you could do is read the year 3 outcomes for the other 2 areas. But you could also have to stop my annotate. See that year 1 is breaking down to like, what are the goals and targets for each of those areas over just the next year? And the reason we lay that out is so that you can see that we know there's a lot of work to do at City or Philly with core members and fundraising and events. How do we begin to like plug in and integrate the work that we want to do so that it becomes comprehensive and embedded in everything we do? So the year one kind of focus, or the focus on year one, tries to kind of map out that there's pieces that you can break off over time that add up to building a shared understanding of building leadership habits, of developing accountability practices. So I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to give you another few moments just to review the year 3 outcomes. And what I'd like you to think about are 2 things. One, how do you see these moving City or Philly from one place to another? And do you see that distinction in that table? And then 2, how do you see those 3 takeaways coming to life through those outcomes? How do you see building a shared foundation, developing leadership practices, and establishing accountability practices come through that table? So take about 5 minutes or however long you'd like. I'm going to turn off my screen to signify it's time to pause the video, and I'll see you back in a few minutes. All right, welcome back. What I've wanted to do over these few minutes is go through those 4 areas of this report as a way to kind of just ensure that we're all operating from the same or kind of level understanding of what's in this report for you all. I wanted you to really see the 3 key takeaways. I wanted you to really think about the from to place, get into a bit of like that data, kind of that really detailed data from the focus groups and interviews, knowing that there's other places in this report that you can look at, and then really kind of start to make sense of the DBIE approach. If I was in your shoes, I know what I would be thinking. That I have a team and people that are relying on me for a lot of things. And how do I begin to make sense of and communicate and talk to other people about this? Here's what I would say. If I just kind of back out everything that we've talked about over the next few minutes, is that 1, City or Philly has a clear commitment to learning and growing in DBIE. And I think that's come through in so many of the conversations that I've had with your staff. And that we want to learn and grow, and we want to do better, right? I remember my grandma would tell me that if you know better, you do better, right? And so I think part of this is knowing, all right, we know, and now we want to do. And what I would say is that if I was thinking about talking to other people on the team, that here's how we're going to do that. We're going to build a bridge together to a future state of what it looks like to live and work at City or Philly. The way we're going to do that is we're going to build foundational understanding around the core concepts, so we have shared understanding of what that means in the context of our work. The second thing we're going to do is we're going to build together leadership practices that help us engage in the type of conversation and work that we need to do to really have a lasting impact in Philadelphia for ourselves and for the kids and families and communities we serve. And third, we're going to establish accountability practices for us as individuals, given who we are and given our background, our experience and identity, and collective accountability, and have the agency to do that. And we know that's important, right? Because we listen to the experiences of our staff. We've heard what people have told us. We've worked collaboratively with each other, and we know that this is the work and the path that we want to be on together. And what I would say lastly is that this is a continued journey for us. We are going to continue to learn and grow as we do this work, but we want to be clear that we have a vision for what we want to be true. We've taken time to think about what it's going to take from us as individuals and collectively, and we're committed to doing this work together. So I'm going to leave you with that closing comment. And one last time, I'm going to invite you to pause the video. I won't be returning this time, but pause the video and make note of how would you very succinctly talk about what you took away from this report. You've heard me talk about it. Here's the 3 takeaways, which I want you to hold on to. Here's where this all came from. Here's what it means for us over the next year or 2. Put that in some of your own words, just quickly, maybe jot it down or write it down, bullet points. because that's the work now we have to do as leaders in our communities and organizations to move us to a different place. Appreciate this time. Take some time to do that, and I look forward to talking to you all again soon.